My name's Penny, as I said. I'm the Greens lead Senate candidate, but I'm also a secondary school teacher and have been. This year marks 30 years since I taught my first class, and I can't believe that much time has gone by. In that time, I've taught right across Queensland. So I've taught in the southeast corner, down at Redlands and at Cleveland. I've taught at Brisbane. I did a brief stint. I actually did my prac at Brisbane State High, my final one. That was interesting. I've taught in Wide Bay, Burnett, Bundaberg, Gin, Gladstone. That's where I am now. I resigned last term, so I was acting deputy principal last term and resigned a couple of weeks ago when nominations went in. And I've also taught on Cape York and in the Torres Strait. And also done a stint in the UK for 12 months as well. And I remember at the time being so grateful that, you know, education in Queensland wasn't going the way of UK, and here we are 10 years later and it looks pretty much the same. So for those of you who are teachers, there are probably some common themes that you're going to hear from me, and it'll be interesting to share our stories and see what matches up. What I can tell you is it was teaching that actually politicised me. So I have been a member of the Queensland Teachers Union from the get-go, and I'm a very proud member of that union. I have had times when I think they're not doing as good a job as they need to, but I also have to remind myself that we are the union, and so if we don't think they're doing a good enough job, we need to get in and change that, a bit like politics and building a movement with the Greens. But it was education that politicised me, and it was teaching on Cape York that did that. So I did a year in Brisbane at Kenmore State High School, and at the end of that year, my husband and I got a required transfer to Gladstone. And I remember being called. My husband was at Acacia Ridge High, as it was at the time. I was over at Kenmore, and it was transfer day, and we had 2 kids under the age of 2, and we'd filled out the form to say, please don't transfer us for 1 year. We'll go anywhere you want the year after, but just give us 1 year so our kids can be a bit older than 2 under the age of 2. I gave birth in my first year of teaching. And they sent us to Gladstone, and there was no childcare in Gladstone. And I remember sitting in the principal's office crying and saying, what are we going to do? There's no childcare there. And his response was, you could do it, my wife did. And I said, what was that? And he said, she resigned. I went, yeah, no, that's not going to happen. So we went to Gladstone, and I spent 6 years there, and it was very challenging. Certainly very challenging compared to Kenmore State High School from my perspective. And it opened my eyes very early on to the disparity in funding even within the state education system. The resources that I had at Kenmore State High School compared to the ones I had at Tallua High School, which is where I originally got transferred to, and then across to Gladstone State High School, were quite different. And that sort of got me thinking very early on in my career that this isn't quite right. We spent 6 years in Gladstone, and then we decided that we didn't want to stay there at that point in time. And so my husband wanted to go where the fishing was good, and so we went to Cape York, and we ended up at Bamaga P12 school as it was then. And that is where I really got to understand, first of all, the appalling way in which First Nations communities are treated by the government in terms of services and consultation, and further disparity between some schools in Education Queensland and others. And the example that I had on Cape York was if you were at Bamaga P12 school, the downstairs classrooms had a foot of water in them virtually every time it rained. I don't know if you've been to Cape York, it rains 6 months of the year. So we had downstairs classrooms that we couldn't use on our secondary campus every time it rained. No one was doing anything about that. Classrooms had never been painted in 20 years. In the end, teachers on my staff, I was a head of middle school, we all went and bought paint from Thursday Island and painted them ourselves. And the thing that really got me was that the high school on Thursday Island was pristine. And every single time Anna Bligh, who was the Education Minister at the time, wanted to make an announcement about what they were doing in First Nations schools, she would go to TI. And they'd do the presser and it'd all be shiny and nice, and we'd be across the water and our schools falling down around our ears. And the number of times that I wrote directly to the Minister of Education to say, please come and see what it's like in our school and what it's like for this community, and got nothing. And then my parents came and visited, and my parents were ex-teachers, and they were appalled. And so they wrote to the Education Minister and said, we've been to Cape York, we've been to Bambuka P12 school, we're ex-teachers, we cannot believe the standard of that particular school and what the students are having to put up with. Can you do something about that? And the way that that got dealt with was the principal got a letter from the minister's office, landed on his desk saying, someone from the community is complaining about your school, please explain. And my parents were mortified because the last thing they wanted to do was to create work for the principal. So the second thing that happened when we were in Cape York as well was I was asked by the elders in the community to actually go and sit in on the government consultation. And it was at the time when the government was talking about making dry communities and imposing a whole range of things on First Nations communities, but they were telling people in the media and in the public that they weren't going to do anything to First Nations communities that they didn't want, that they were going to consult over it and everyone would be happy and that's how they would move forward. And so I'm sitting in the council chambers in Bamaga with the elders and the minister walks in. It wasn't the Education Minister, it was whoever was doing the First Nations stuff at the time. And with all their staff, they sat down and they literally, the first words that came out of their mouth was, here are all the things that are non-negotiable, but we're happy to talk to you about this. And I just was appalled. I was embarrassed as a white person sitting in a room with First Nations people to be listening to white government ministers basically saying that what they'd been saying out in the media was bullshit. And I went, yeah, okay, things have to change. So when I left Bamaga, I wanted to make a difference. And I thought the way to do that was to learn about the law. So I went and did a law degree and a master's in law, and I practiced for 5 years. And what I learnt in that process was A, the law's an arse and doesn't fix a lot, and B, I really liked teaching. So I went back to teaching, and I went back in 2012. So out of the 30 years that I've been working, 5 was in law and 25 has been in education. And I've been back in school since 2012. The thing that has really, I think, dawned on me in the last 5 years is that those of you who are public school teachers would know that about a decade ago we all started campaigning for the Gonski reforms. We wanted to increase funding to the schooling resource standard. We wanted schools to be at 100%. We were unsuccessful in that campaign. I have a lot of feelings about why that campaign was unsuccessful. I have more feelings about why I think that every child, every school campaign isn't going to be successful either. But we can talk about that another time. But for a long time I kept thinking, you know, if we can just get 100% of the schooling resource standard, if we can fix that problem, we can fix public education. And now I've reached the point where I've realised that that is not going to be enough. I don't know about you, but last term I had a kid in my class who had no power and no water to the shed that his family was living in because they can't get housing in Gladstone. I've had a girl who was in crisis care, so out-of-home care, and she got placed, I kid you not, underneath a house. So not properly locked up, 16-year-old girl under a house, completely unsafe, and the school having to step in and try and find crisis accommodation for her. High numbers of kids in crisis care, high numbers of kids who need mental health services, and if you're in Gladstone, or Mackay, as I heard last night when we were there, you know, unless you're ready to injure yourself and you are at risk of immediate harm, in which case the hospital will see you, but they'll check you out the next morning, you're not going to see a psychologist or a mental health professional for 6 months. And so the school is trying to fill that void. So I've reached the point where I have really come to the view that if we don't actually change all of it, if we don't increase job seeker and welfare payments to above the poverty line, if we don't fix dental and mental into Medicare, if we don't fix all that other stuff, fully funding education is not going to be enough. So in this campaign, a big motivator for me has been certainly education. It's still the thing that I'm really passionate about. But I've really recognised that if we don't address all of that social inequality, no amount of money pumped into our schools is going to fix anything. Because we can't, you all know, those of you who are teachers, if a kid's hungry or they don't have a roof over their head, we're fighting an uphill battle. So my motivation in this campaign is much bigger than just education funding. Having said that, I'm really proud to be able to stand as a candidate on a platform of being the only party, because not even Labor has committed at this election, to fully funding our public schools. So the Greens policy that we are taking to this election for schools is a $49 billion injection into public education to make sure that every school is at 100% of the schooling resource standard, and that we are covering those additional things that parents are having to pay for, and or carers or whoever happens to be, or independent students. No, I can't get over the number of independent students now that we have in Gladstone who are actually trying to look after themselves. And I know that some of our other panellists are going to talk about some of those additional fees, which I think have gotten to the point where they are prohibitive. All right, there are kids who can't even afford to pay the fees in a public school. So I'm really excited about the fact that we have committed to that. I don't know if you've been following the figures, but the federal government over the last decade has increased funding to private schools at 5 times the rate that they have been funding state schools, which I just think is appalling. My view, public money, public schools. Even our state Labor government is only funding 69% of their share of 80% of the student resource, schooling resource standard. So that tells you that right now neither major party is willing to commit the money that's required to improve our public school system. The other thing that we have committed to in this election platform is a $400 million infrastructure fund. I don't know if you're aware, I reckon you probably are because you're teachers, but the federal government has a multi-million-dollar infrastructure fund, but it is only for private schools. So the Greens are saying, well, yeah, I know, right? Your taxpayer dollars. There you go, private schools. You have another rowing shed. Which is pretty, I was talking to members of the QTU in Townsville with Larissa last year, and they were talking about the fact that the private school up the road had gotten money from the federal fund to improve their lake out the front of their school. I kid you not. That is the state of things. So that fund would be $400 million. 80% of that money would be quarantined for public schools because we need a massive investment. The other thing that we included in our education platform, which I'd be interesting to find out, those of you who are in school at the moment, what your experience has been, but we've also committed $221 million to be spent over the next 12 months to do air quality audits in every classroom in the country and to provide CO2 monitors and HEPA filters. I don't know about you. As I said, I was acting deputy last term. I had a quarter of my staff out every day for about 5 weeks due to COVID. And it's going to be flu season soon, and I bought my own CO2 monitor, and it was really clear to me why everyone was getting sick. So there's a lot of studies that are increasingly coming out to say that we can really reduce, and COVID's not going to be the last thing that's going to rip through our schools, so we can really improve air quality for our kids. I've also been now monitoring CO2 and going, that's why those kids are falling asleep by lunchtime, because the air quality is so rubbish that they actually can't stay awake because there's so much CO2 in the room. So I think that's a really good policy that would change the environment that our kids are in and is really worth doing. So that's our schools platform. There's also $10 million for the co-design of a national inclusive education program to actually properly design and develop how we actually do inclusion properly. I know from my experience as a teacher, the thing that's most frustrating about the inclusion agenda is that everybody wants inclusion to happen and nobody wants to resource it properly. So students, both those who would benefit from inclusion and those who are in mainstream, everybody's losing out because no one's being resourced properly to make that happen properly. So I think, and that has been designed, which I think is really important, in conjunction with Senator Jordan Steele-John and he has worked with members of the disability community as well as the education sector to talk about how that co-design might work, which I think is great. Just in terms of the stuff at either side of that, so I think our early childhood, our childcare policy is really important too. I was at a trauma-informed education practice PD very early on this year, and they were talking about the fact that a child between the ages of 0 and 5 needs, I think it was around 12 hours a week of really positive educational experience, feedback, positive parenting, to make the neural connections that they need to not get to 5 years of age and essentially have a trauma background. And the first thing that came into my head was our childcare policy would fix that. Because if every child has access to good quality early childhood education through that policy, which it does, we actually mean that all our kids get a fair start. And some of those kids who have parents that have real challenges are still getting the education and the feedback and the positive reinforcement that they need to make sure that they're not starting behind when they get to preschool and grade 1. And I think that could fundamentally change the nature of some of the kids that we have in front of us as teachers. So I think that's really important. And then at the other end, our free university in TAFE, I just think is so important. I'm a head of Department of Humanities and Languages when I'm not resigned from EQ to running elections. And I know from the anecdotal evidence of students in my classes and our faculty that the minute they doubled the cost of a humanities degree, those kids turned around and said, I'm now rethinking whether I'm actually going to go to uni. And I just think that's appalling. I know as somebody who lives in the regions that a young person who is not only having to think about how much debt they're going to incur for their course, but who also has to live out of home, who has to pay additional rent. Families, you know, north of the sunny coast are making decisions not to send their kids on to tertiary because it's now just cost prohibitive. And it's similar for people who are living in the southeast corner now who can't afford rent, can't find somewhere to live. You know, cost of living's rising, and saddling everyone with a massive debt before they even start their working life is just not okay. So I think making TAFE and university free again, and I think the again is really important. We did it before. There's no reason why we can't go back to how it was. And I also think wiping the debt of students who have an outstanding HECS debt is a really good way that we can address cost of living issues and really level up the playing field to give people a decent start. So I'm really proud to be campaigning at this election on a fantastic education platform. I know from talking to the QTU that they really like our platform too. For those of you who are QTU members, please open your email that you're going to get the night before pre-poll opens. They're doing a special edition of the Journal, an electronic election one, and I have a piece in there, which I'm really excited about, the fact that they've given a platform to a Greens candidate to say, hey, this is why you should vote Greens for education at this election, I think is really exciting. So that's me, and I've probably talked a bit longer than I was supposed to, but I think covering our whole platform from early childhood to TAFE and uni is really important.